I remember the wind being colder than November should feel in Charleston, the kind that makes the flags crack against the poles and makes you stand straighter. Veterans Day week always brings people out to the Charleston War Memorial Park. Everyone put on their best smile, their best story about service, their best clothes. I wore a plain black dress, hair pulled back, small silver earrings Michael once bought me in Fayetteville. I wanted to look respectful, but I also wanted to disappear. I was 29, too young in their eyes to carry a folded flag for the rest of my life. 2 women were just ahead of me, wives of senior officers, the kind that never had to fight to be let through a gate. I heard them before I even saw their faces. One of them said she is too young to be a war widow, and the other answered, maybe she just likes the attention. They did not whisper. They wanted me to hear it. This is what toxic family sounds like even when it is not your own blood, I thought. It stings the same. A man in a navy blazer turned to me and asked with polite confusion, "Whose wife were you again?" I kept my voice low. "Captain Michael Carter." The 2 women looked back at me then. Their eyes changed in a way I knew too well. One of them smiled the thin kind of smile people give when they think your marriage was a mistake. Oh, that Carter. As if my husband was a story they already judged, as if I was just a widow renting grief. I saw Lieutenant Ryan Pierce further down the row. Younger than most here, haircut high and tight, still carrying himself like a man who thought rules mattered. He looked at me longer than was normal, like he recognized the name Carter and could not place why. Then his gaze moved past me toward the back where the senior guests were coming in. My stomach tightened. Richard Carter was walking beside Colonel Dalton, both of them in dark coats, shoulders, square faces carved in stone for the cameras. My father-in-law and the officer who used to serve under my husband, the 2 men who had never once asked me how I was surviving. The master of ceremonies called everyone to attention. A band in dress uniform stood ready. The screen behind the podium flickered with the opening montage. Photos of men and women in uniform appeared one after another, while the speakers read names. The sound system was the same model we used at Fort Jackson. I knew every wire inside that thing. I also knew when something was wrong. The announcer said today we honor Captain Michael Carter of the United States Army. My chest lifted. I straightened my shoulders. People around me turned their heads a little, trying to spot me. I was ready to hear his voice again. I was ready to let the sadness come over me, the good kind, the kind that reminds you why you loved someone. The video cut to a still photo of Michael smiling in desert gear. Then came the audio. It was his voice. Calm, warm. The voice that never shouted unless there was danger. "This is Captain Carter. Thank you for standing with my family." Then silence. No second sentence. No mission context. No warning. Just a hard cut to the next soldier. My heart slammed so hard I tasted metal. Around me, no one reacted because no one else knew there should have been more. They just saw a handsome officer on the screen and heard one sentence and thought that was it. But I knew. Michael had recorded a final message before that mission. He had told me once in an email that he wanted command to have context. Context for what went wrong. Context for who failed him. It was not here. Someone had removed it. I looked straight to the back. Richard Carter was no longer watching the screen. He was watching me. Colonel Dalton leaned toward him. They exchanged one short look. Quick, nervous, like men who had just heard a door they thought was locked move an inch. That was the moment the humiliation turned into curiosity and then into something hotter. This was not only family betrayal, this was someone trying to erase a soldier who could still speak after death. This was betrayal, family karma, waiting to happen. I stood there in my plain dress while people clapped for the next name, and I told myself very quietly, Emily, find out who cut his voice and make them listen to it in front of everyone. The funeral had been held under a heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on everything, even the flags. 2 years ago, The field outside the chapel at Fort Jackson was lined with folding chairs and faces that I did not know, faces that belonged to men who had served under my husband, Captain Michael Carter. I remember the crisp sound of boots on pavement, the folded flag pressed into my hands, the tremble in my arms, as if my body refused to believe what it was holding. Richard Carter stood beside me with the stillness of a monument. He said nothing until the service ended. When the last note of taps faded, he turned toward me and spoke in the same cold tone he used to brief soldiers. "You married a soldier, Emily. You knew the risks." There was no sympathy in his voice, only the judgment of a man who had already decided my grief was excessive. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, stood behind him, her gloved hand covering her mouth, her eyes down. She whispered something about God's will, but even her voice trembled under Richard's stare. People came to shake my hand to tell me what an honor it had been to serve with Michael, how he had been a good man. I nodded to each of them and kept my tears for later. After the last guest left, Richard asked me to step inside the family car. He wanted to discuss the future. The word future sounded like an insult. In the car, he said it would be better if I moved out of the house on base. He said it would help everyone heal. I realized he meant it would help him not to see me. Evelyn offered to let me stay with her, but Richard cut her off. His decision was final. He dropped me at the small apartment Michael and I had rented before deployment. It still smelled like his shaving cream and the dust from his boots. For a week, I lived inside silence. Then the calls started, reporters wanting a statement, veterans asking to send condolences. Richard told me to forward everything to him. He said the family would handle communications. He never said family meant him alone. One night, when the calls stopped, I went to the base chapel to feel close to Michael. It was quiet except for the faint hum of a vending machine. I sat in the back pew and tried to remember his voice. I still had messages from him, the kind he sent between missions, brief, half-coded, full of optimism. The last one ended with a promise that he would be careful. He always kept promises. On my way out, I heard voices from the adjoining office. Richard was there, speaking on a secure phone, the same one he used for official contacts. His tone was low but sharp. "We lost more than a man," he said. "We lost a witness." I froze. The word witness hit like a physical thing. Another voice answered, muffled but firm. "We cleaned it up. There will be no leak." I stepped back into the hallway, my heart hammering. They could not see me from where I stood. I waited until I heard the click of the phone being set down and the scrape of a chair. Then I left quietly, walking into the night air. The cold bit through my coat, but I barely felt it. The meaning of the words circled in my head. A witness. Cleaned it up. My husband had died during an ambush in a region marked safe. The report said it was a communications failure. I had been on comms duty that week. I knew the system had been working. What if it was not a failure at all? What if it was a setup? I told myself I could have misheard that grief was making me imagine things. Still, the next day I asked a former contact in logistics about the mission code. He told me quietly that the supply route had been changed the night before the ambush, signed off by Richard and one other officer, whose name he refused to give. I thanked him and hung up. I sat for a long time staring at the folded flag on the table. Pity had burned away into something sharper. The rejection that had crushed me now felt like a shield. If they thought I was weak, they would not see me coming. I began to collect everything Michael had ever sent, every file, every recording. I backed them up, labeled them, studied them. I found no proof, not yet, but I found purpose. That night, as the wind shook the window, I whispered to his picture, "I am still your wife, Michael. I will find what they took from you." That was the first moment the idea of revenge stopped feeling sinful and started feeling like justice. Fort Jackson was a world that smelled of machine oil, old coffee, and the faint static of radios that never stopped humming. I returned there as a civilian contractor working in the audio communications department, fixing cables, maintaining speakers, and testing microphones before ceremonies. It was supposed to be quiet work, safe work, the kind where you could hide among equipment and never have to explain who you used to be. My first day, I signed the paperwork, tucked my badge into my pocket, and walked into the operations room. The moment I saw the nameplate on the desk, my stomach tightened. Sergeant Major Dalton. The same Dalton who had once served under Michael. He looked up from a stack of files, eyes narrowing when he recognized me. "Carter," he said slowly, drawing out the name like a problem. I nodded politely. "Good morning, Sergeant Major. I am assigned to the Communications Maintenance Team." His mouth curved into something that was not a smile. "So you are still hanging around," he said. "You are just the wife of a captain, not one of us." His tone carried that familiar poison, the kind that said, I did not belong anywhere. I forced a neutral expression and moved to the equipment shelves. Years of dealing with Richard had taught me that silence could cut sharper than any reply. Over the next weeks, Dalton made my tasks harder. He assigned me to fix equipment no one else wanted to touch, sent me to the far end of the base during drills, and corrected me in front of younger techs just to watch me blush. I kept my head down. I needed to stay close to the network servers. Michael's mission logs were archived here somewhere behind layers of restricted access. Dalton thought he was humiliating me. I was mapping the system while he talked. Every time he barked a comment, I memorized another route through the audio control panels. One afternoon, he slammed a folder on my desk. "This inventory report is full of errors. You people never double-check anything." I opened it. The numbers were not mistakes. They were changed deliberately. I glanced at the signatures and saw his initials at the bottom. Quietly, I slid a small digital recorder from my toolkit into the space behind the shelf in his office. I told myself it was only precaution, a way to collect how he treated staff. Still, a small voice whispered that I wanted something more. Revenge did not always come from rage. Sometimes it came from curiosity. Over the next few days, the recorder picked up long hours of his voice. He swore at suppliers, complained about inspections, and one night left the door half open during a phone call. I was in the hallway fixing a speaker cable when I heard him say it. "We can move the rest through procurement next week. No one checks those numbers." He laughed after that, a short, greedy laugh that made my skin crawl. Later, when everyone left, I retrieved the device and transferred the recordings. Dalton was altering supply manifests, moving funds meant for communications gear into personal accounts. It was small-scale corruption, the kind that festers under the uniform of authority. I should have turned it in. Instead, I waited. The right moment came a week later during a base-wide maintenance test. The system was being rebooted, and I was alone in the control booth testing the intercom frequencies. I queued the list of test files, mostly static bursts and tone sweeps. Then I saw one unlabeled file in the same folder. Without thinking, I clicked play. Dalton's voice filled the room, loud and unmistakable. I told that idiot to shut up about the extra boxes, or I would have him transferred to Alaska. The sound echoed through the intercom channel that connected to the entire administrative wing. For 3 full seconds, I froze. Then the realization hit me like a punch. The wrong channel was live. The base was hearing him in real time. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Then the chatter began, doors opening, confused voices, someone laughing in disbelief. I cut the feed and stood there staring at the monitor. My heart raced, but a small, involuntary smile crept across my face. It was the kind of accident that felt like justice wearing a disguise. Later that afternoon, Dalton stormed into the control room, red-faced. Who authorized the test he demanded? I kept my voice even. I did, sir. It was a routine systems check. He glared at me, searching for guilt. His pride would not let him accuse me directly. The next morning, the command office issued a memo about maintaining professionalism over open channels. Dalton was officially reprimanded, a temporary mark on his record. He had no idea where it came from. Around the office, people whispered, smirked, and avoided eye contact when he passed. I kept my head down, tightening cables and labeling frequencies, pretending not to notice. It was a small victory, but it warmed the air around me. For once, I felt something lighter than grief. Revenge could be quiet. It could look like competence. It could sound like a man hearing his own arrogance echo through the speakers he once controlled. That night, I sat alone in the staff break room sipping coffee gone cold and thought about Michael. He had always said people reveal themselves when they think no one is listening. Maybe that was true. Maybe the dead still teach lessons through the living. I packed my tools, checked the recorder again, and walked out under the flickering hallway lights. The base was quiet, but somewhere deep inside it, secrets were starting to hum. The invitation came in an envelope so formal, it felt like a summons. The handwriting belonged to Evelyn Carter. She called it a memorial dinner for Michael, a way to honor his memory. It had been 2 years since the funeral, and I had heard nothing from them except for the occasional official document that needed my signature. I hesitated for days before replying. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part wanted to see what they would say when they had to look me in the eye again. I arrived at their house just after sunset. The Carter home sat on a quiet street lined with magnolia trees, the kind of southern perfection that photographs well. Inside, the air smelled like polished wood and expensive wine. Family portraits covered the walls, most of them showing Richard in uniform and Michael at various promotions. The only photo of me and Michael had been cropped so tight you could not tell whose hand was holding his. Evelyn greeted me first, her smile polite but brittle. "Emily," she said softly, "you look well." "Thank you, ma'am," I replied. Richard appeared from the dining room with a glass of scotch already in hand. His eyes scanned me the way an officer checks a report for flaws. Vanessa, Michael's sister-in-law, came next, adjusting her pearl necklace and offering a hug that lasted half a second. We all sat around the long table set for 5. Evelyn had prepared roast chicken, the same meal she used to make when Michael came home on leave. For a moment, I almost relaxed. Then Richard started talking. He spoke about legacy, about sacrifice, about how the family name must remain untarnished. Finally, he looked at me. "You should move on, Emily. Maybe remarry someone more stable." The word stable clung in the air like smoke. I set my fork down carefully and forced a calm tone. "I appreciate your concern, sir, but I'm fine where I am." Vanessa gave a small laugh. "It must be lonely," she said. I smiled back. "It can be, but silence has its uses." They didn't know what to do with that. The rest of dinner passed with awkward politeness. Richard talked about upcoming events at the Veterans Council. Evelyn tried to smooth things over by asking about my work, and Vanessa complained about the humidity. I answered briefly, keeping my face neutral. When dinner ended, Evelyn suggested coffee in the living room. I followed them into a space that looked more like a museum than a home. Every shelf was lined with medals, framed certificates, and photographs of Michael with Richard. One in particular caught my attention. It showed the two of them at a ceremony shaking hands in front of an American flag. Richard's smile was wide and proud. Michael's looked practiced. Something in me tightened. While Richard went to pour coffee and Evelyn excused herself to the kitchen, I noticed a small key ring on the side table near the bookshelf. Among the house keys and car fob was a flat brass key stamped with the code of a military-issued safe. I recognized it immediately. It was the same kind used to secure classified materials, the kind that should have been returned after an officer's death. My pulse quickened. Why would Richard still have it? I crouched slightly, pretending to look at a photo, and noted the engraving on the tag. MCFJ 42. Michael Carter, Fort Jackson. The key to his personal field safe. I slipped my phone from my pocket and quietly snapped a photo of the tag before standing again. Richard came back in oblivious, carrying the coffee tray. He handed me a cup with forced courtesy. I took a slow sip, pretending not to taste the bitterness of power games hidden under sugar. The conversation drifted to memorial funds and how expensive ceremonies had become. Richard mentioned that he was handling all of Michael's remaining accounts. He said it as if I should be grateful. I smiled thinly and nodded. When the evening finally wound down, Evelyn walked me to the door. Her hand lingered on mine. She whispered, "I am glad you came, Emily. He never talks about Michael anymore. It hurts him more than he shows." I squeezed her hand gently. He will have to face it eventually, I said. The ride back to my apartment was quiet except for the echo of Richard's words. Maybe remarry someone more stable, maybe disappear, maybe stop existing in their version of the story. That night, I could not sleep. I kept seeing that photo on the wall, Michael smiling beside the man who had erased him. The next morning, I decided to do something small but precise. Revenge did not need to be loud to feel right. I drove back to the Carter house under the excuse of returning a scarf Evelyn had left in my bag. No one answered when I knocked. Their housekeeper let me in, saying the family had gone to church. I thanked her and stepped inside. The living room was exactly as I remembered. I opened my purse and took out a framed photo I had brought from home. It showed Michael and me standing side by side in uniform, both of us smiling after his promotion. It had always been my favorite. I replaced the photo of Richard and Michael with it, aligning it perfectly on the mantel. It was not destruction. It was correction. I stood back and felt a strange calm. Before leaving, I whispered to the air, he earned his own honor. The next morning, Evelyn called me. Her voice was trembling. Emily, I saw the picture. It is beautiful. Thank you. I could hear her crying softly. Then Richard's voice came faintly in the background, sharp and angry, demanding who had touched his wall. I hung up before she could say more. Sitting alone in my kitchen, I smiled into my coffee. The world had not changed, but for once the truth had shifted slightly in my favor. Small acts could be louder than shouting. Sometimes justice begins with the rearrangement of a single photograph. Rumors move faster than sound inside a base. They start in the corners of offices, travel through break rooms, and end up echoing across the cafeteria before lunch. I learned this the morning I walked into Fort Jackson's main dining hall, and every conversation stopped just long enough to notice me. I had grown used to polite distance, but that silence was different. It was the kind that follows a story people are still deciding whether to believe. I set my tray down and felt their eyes on my back. The week before, Dalton had been seen speaking with one of the civilian supervisors, his hands moving in wide gestures. By Monday, everyone knew his version of me. According to him, I had used my husband's name to secure my position. I had never earned anything on my own, and the only reason I stayed was to collect sympathy. He made it sound almost noble, as if he were warning others to be cautious about favoritism. It was humiliation wrapped in moral concern, and people love that kind of gossip. I tried to keep my head high. There was work to finish and equipment to test. I told myself that truth would outlive noise, but truth often whispers while lies sing. As I stood in line for coffee, I could feel the weight of whispers following me. A group of young technicians at the next table went quiet as I passed. One of them, a private with bright red hair and the awkward energy of someone new, blurted out without thinking, "Ma'am, sorry for your dead husband, ma'am." The words tumbled out so fast he looked terrified after saying them. I turned toward him slowly. For a second, he looked like he wanted to vanish into his uniform. I gave him a small smile. "He's not dead in memory, soldier, just quieter." The cafeteria went still again. Then someone laughed nervously, and the sound spread like a thaw. The boy's shoulders relaxed. I carried my coffee to a corner table and sat down, pretending to check my phone. Inside, though, I felt something shift. That moment, that clumsy kindness from a stranger reminded me that not everyone followed Dalton's lead. Some people just repeated what they heard because they didn't know better. I took a sip of coffee, let it burn my throat, and thought about how easily power shaped stories. Dalton had always needed to feel above someone. When he realized I would not rise to his bait, he built a version of me that would. A woman dependent, sentimental, unfit for military work. The opposite of what Michael had seen when he asked me to marry him. Later that afternoon, I walked through the communications wing checking the sound relays. Dalton was in his office door, half-open voice, booming as usual. He was lecturing a junior officer about chain of command. I paused for a moment, listening. The words hit like background noise. Then I realized the junior officer was Ryan Pierce, the same one who had looked at me during the memorial. He sounded uneasy trying to defend something about a system error. Dalton cut him off sharply. "You do not question orders, Lieutenant, especially from those who have earned their place." His voice carried that same sneer he used on me. I moved on quietly. That night, I found the courage to do something small but important. I opened the personnel database and updated a few maintenance reports that had been wrongly attributed to others. My name went where it belonged, not hidden under initials. It was not rebellion, only accuracy. Still, it felt like taking back a fragment of dignity. Over the next days, the rumor began to lose energy. People had new things to talk about. I focused on work, stayed polite, and gave no one reason to feed the story. Dalton avoided direct confrontation, though his glares lingered. Once during a meeting, he tried to make a joke about civilians being fragile. I met his eyes and said evenly, "Some of us learn resilience the hard way, sir." The room went quiet. No one laughed. He moved on to the next topic. Later, Grace from the security division stopped me in the hall. "Nice line," she said. He needed to hear that. I smiled faintly. Sometimes silence is louder, she nodded, approving. By Friday, things at the base felt almost normal again. The cafeteria chatter had turned to sports scores and weekend plans. I sat with Grace and a few others talking about equipment upgrades. Private Jones passed by, caught my eye, and gave a shy salute. I returned it with a nod. The sting of the rumor had faded into something smaller, something almost instructive. I had learned that humiliation could be endured, that pity could be reshaped into quiet strength. Every time someone underestimated me, it gave me more space to move unseen. I thought of Michael then, of how he used to say that battles are won long before the first shot. The trick is to stay steady while others waste energy. When I left the cafeteria, the afternoon sun was sharp and blinding. I paused outside, looking toward the flagpole where the breeze tugged at the stars and stripes. The same wind carried the faint smell of jet fuel from the nearby airfield. It was the smell of movement, of something about to change. For the first time in months, I felt ready. The noise around me had quieted, but beneath it, another kind of tension was building. I did not know yet that the next discovery would make every rumor look like a harmless whisper. By the second month at Fort Jackson, the air around me had changed. It was not the heat or the smell of oil and dust that hung over the base. It was the quiet pause that followed me into rooms. I could feel it before I even knew the story. Sergeant Major Dalton had made sure of that. It began as a casual comment in the officers' lounge, the kind that sounds harmless when it leaves the mouth of a superior. He told people I had used my husband's name to get this position, that I was living off pity, that the Army had a soft spot for widows who cried at the right moments. He said it with a grin, and people laughed because they wanted to stay on his good side. Within days, everyone knew his version of who I was. I felt it most at the cafeteria. The first morning it happened, I walked in with my tray, balancing a cup of coffee and a sandwich, and the noise around me dropped, like someone had pulled a switch. Dozens of conversations stopped. Spoons clinked, and then there was that hum of low whispers that tried to sound casual. I kept walking, chin level, and chose an empty table near the window. My uniform looked too clean, my hair too neat, and I could sense the judgment in every glance. The irony was that I had never used Michael's name for anything. If anything, it closed more doors than it opened. People liked him as a memory, but not as a reminder. The young soldiers who came after him grew up hearing his name mentioned in briefings, never realizing that his widow worked down the hall fixing their sound systems. As I stirred my coffee, I heard a tray slide across the table. It was Private Jones, the red-haired recruit who still called everyone sir or ma'am, even when it was wrong. He stood stiffly beside me, eyes wide with panic at his own courage. "Ma'am, sorry for your dead husband, ma'am." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence. I looked up at him, and the silence of the cafeteria felt like a curtain waiting to drop. For a heartbeat, I considered saying nothing. Then I smiled softly. He is not dead in memory. Soldier. Just quieter. The corners of his mouth twitched. Someone at the next table chuckled not at me but at his discomfort, and the tension broke. The sound of conversation returned clumsy and human. Jones mumbled an apology and hurried away. I watched him go and felt the tightness in my chest ease. The pity in his words was unpolished but honest. It reminded me that not everyone who spoke my name meant harm. Most people simply followed the tone set by power. Later that day, I passed Dalton in the corridor outside the logistics office. He was talking to another officer about supply reports, his voice full of easy confidence. When he noticed me, his smile turned thin. "Everything running smoothly, Mrs. Carter," I answered evenly. "Yes, Sergeant Major, just making sure the system stays honest." His eyes flickered, unsure if he had heard a threat. I walked away before he could decide. That night, as I sat alone in the small maintenance lab, I thought about how much space humiliation takes up inside a person. It eats the hours, the sleep, the energy. I decided not to let it. I began recording my own work logs, making sure every correction, every successful repair carried my signature. If Dalton wanted to say I hid behind Michael's name, I would drown him in proof of competence. The next morning, Grace stopped by with her easy grin. "Word around the hall is that Dalton's been warned to stop spreading stories," she said. "Apparently someone higher up heard the wrong thing over lunch." I raised an eyebrow. "How unfortunate," I said. She winked. "You keep doing your job, honey. Let the noise choke itself." That afternoon during a meeting, Dalton tried to regain control of the narrative. He made a joke about civilians being delicate about how they wilt under pressure. I felt every eye in the room slide toward me. I met his gaze and said, "Some of us learn resilience the hard way, sir." The silence that followed was sharp. Then Ryan Pierce, the young lieutenant who had watched me at the memorial, cleared his throat. "Respect is earned," he said quietly. Dalton's jaw tightened. He dismissed the room without another word. When I left, Pierce caught up to me in the hall. "Sorry if that was out of line, ma'am." "Not at all, Lieutenant," I said. "Sometimes the truth needs company." He smiled awkwardly and walked away. The rumor began to fade after that. People realized it was safer to stay neutral. I used the quiet to my advantage, finishing tasks ahead of schedule, rebuilding trust through patience. One evening, as the sun bled through the blinds, I stood by the window watching the flag lower for the day. The sound of retreat echoed across the base brass and steady. I thought about Michael, about how he used to say discipline was not about obeying, but about knowing when to stand your ground. I whispered under my breath, "I am learning." The humiliation had turned into fuel. It taught me how to move without noise, how to make every insult into camouflage. By the end of that week, the base had found new gossip. Dalton had found new targets, and I had found something stronger than their judgment. I had found composure, the kind that does not need to shout to be heard. It was late when I finally decided to go through the old drive. Most of the archive systems at Fort Jackson had been updated, but there was a section in the communication database that still held files from before Michael's final deployment. It was marked obsolete, the kind of label that keeps people from digging too deep. I waited until the shift ended and the office lights dimmed. Only the low hum of the servers filled the room. I logged in under my credentials and opened the maintenance console. The folders scrolled endlessly until one caught my eye. It was titled, "Echo Blue, no date, no description." My breath stalled. The term was one Michael had used once half-jokingly when he told me that every mission had an echo, a trace that never disappears. I clicked. The folder opened to a list of encrypted audio files, most of them standard communications, but one stood out. It was labeled Carter Final. My hands trembled as I entered the decryption key I had used on his old laptop. The screen flickered, then sound filled the room. Michael's voice came through the speakers, rougher than I remembered, the kind of calm that only comes before danger. "If I die, someone betrayed our unit." The line was clear. No static, no hesitation. My heart clenched as the recording continued. He spoke about the convoy route, the delay, the coordinates. Then in the background came another voice, faint but distinct. Dalton's. He said something about supply route A13. A pause, then another voice lower older. Richard. Confirmed. Proceed as planned. The words hit like a physical blow. My throat went dry. I played it again, then again, until I could no longer pretend I was mistaken. The ambush that killed Michael was not a random act of war. It was born from information handed over by the same two men who had lectured me about honor. I sat there in the dim light hands gripping the edge of the desk. The hum of the servers sounded like a heartbeat underwater. For a long moment, I could not move. Then something cold settled inside me. Not grief this time, not shock, focus. The kind of focus that soldiers talk about when everything goes quiet before a fight. I copied the file to a secure drive and erased the system log that showed I had accessed it. I knew enough to protect myself. I also knew this was more than I could handle alone. Grace Holloway was the only person I trusted. She had once been an intelligence officer before retirement turned her into a security consultant. She knew how the system worked and where its cracks were. I walked across the parking lot to her office, the air heavy with the smell of rain. She was still there, lights on coffee half finished. When she saw my face, she frowned. "What did you find, Emily?" I plugged the drive into her computer without a word. The audio played. Her expression changed from curiosity to stillness. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Play your cards right, honey. Revenge isn't loud. It's surgical." I looked at her, unsure if she meant moral or tactical. She explained quietly that this recording was explosive. If I brought it to the wrong person, it could vanish again. She offered to keep a copy in a secure archive she still had access to. I nodded. As she backed up the data, I watched the progress bar move slowly across the screen. Each percent felt like another nail sealing the truth into something real. When she was done, she handed me a second copy. "Keep it somewhere safe, but never at home," she said. You know what men like that do when they smell exposure? I asked her how she had survived years in intelligence without losing herself. She smiled faintly. "You learn that revenge and justice are cousins, but only one of them lets you sleep." I left her office with the drive tucked in my pocket and walked through the drizzle toward the barracks. The rain smelled of metal and earth. Every drop felt like a countdown. Back in my quarters, I sat on the bed and listened again through headphones. The voices were clear now that I knew what to hear. Dalton's arrogance, Richard's authority. Together they had shaped the orders that led Michael into a trap. My chest tightened with fury, but also a strange kind of relief. The uncertainty was gone. The truth was ugly, but it was solid. I could finally build something on it. I opened my laptop and wrote an anonymous message using the internal mail system. It went to the investigative unit at the Pentagon, flagged as sensitive. Attached was a small sample of the recording, just enough to make them curious, not enough to trace it back to me. When I hit send, I felt the faintest tremor in my hands. Not fear, exactly. Anticipation. I turned off the lights and lay down staring at the ceiling until dawn. The truth was out there now, somewhere in a digital maze I could no longer control. I did not know when it would return to me, only that it would. Before sleep took me, I whispered into the darkness. "Michael, they spoke your name like a command. I will make it a verdict." The morning I saw the notice pinned to the board outside headquarters, something inside me clicked into place. The Veterans Memorial ceremony was coming up in Charleston, and the Carter family name was printed right there in bold letters. Richard Carter, retired colonel, would receive a Distinguished Service Award for his lifelong contribution to the armed forces. There was no mention of the ambush, no whisper of the men who had died under his silence. I read the line twice, then folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my pocket. Later that day, I went to Grace. She was in her office drinking her usual black coffee and staring at a screen full of security updates. I placed the notice on her desk. "They are going to celebrate him," I said. She leaned back, eyes narrowing. "And you want to be part of the show." I nodded. The ceremony will use Fort Jackson's technical team for audio support. If I volunteer, no one will question it." Grace thought for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "You really were married to a strategist, honey." She opened a folder and pulled out a small slip of paper. "This is the master login for the event media console. It can override the presentation software if you need to play something manually. The password is Echo Blue Revised. Use it only once." She said it like an oath. I tucked the paper into my wallet. The next few days were a blur of preparation. I submitted a formal request to join the technical crew for the event citing experience and availability. Dalton, unfortunately, was the one reviewing assignments. When he saw my name, he raised an eyebrow. "You want to handle sound for an event like this? It is a high-profile ceremony, Mrs. Carter." I kept my tone polite. "I have done similar setups before, sir." He smiled thinly. "I think we will let the younger staff handle that. You can assist with inventory instead." His voice carried that smug finality that only comes from people who believe they have won before the game starts. I thanked him, turned, and walked out. By the end of the day, I had borrowed a technical staff badge from Grace's contact in logistics. The name on it read Ellen Cooper Audio Division. The irony made me laugh quietly. Sometimes revenge starts with paperwork. 2 days before the ceremony, I visited the event hall during setup. The place was enormous, filled with rows of chairs, banners, and flags. I studied the layout carefully, noting where the main control booth sat behind the stage. The access door was marked "Staff Only," the kind of restriction that works on everyone except those who understand how rules are written. I spent the next hour helping the real crew check cables, pretending to be just another pair of hands. No one questioned me. When Dalton arrived for inspection, I ducked behind the projector and stayed still until he left. Later that evening, Grace called. "Everything ready on your end?" "Almost," I said. He tried to block me. Her laugh came through the phone, warm and rough. "That man has been blocking people his entire career. You just step around him." She paused. "Remember, this is not about revenge for its own sake. It is about truth. Revenge without truth is just noise." I knew what she meant. I also knew I could not back away now. The night before the ceremony, I drove to Charleston. The city glowed with soft light reflecting off the water, calm and deceptive. I checked into a small hotel under an alias and spent hours listening to the recording again. The sound of Michael's voice still carried the weight of command, even after death. "If I die, someone betrayed our unit." Dalton's name, Richard's confirmation. It was all there. I rehearsed how it would sound in a crowded hall. The thought both terrified and thrilled me. I could see their faces already the moment when the sound cut through their applause like a blade. I fell asleep around 3, the plan replaying in my mind like a countdown. The next morning, the ceremony began early. The veterans arrived in full-dress uniform medals glinting under the bright Charleston sun. I wore my plain black suit hair, tied neatly badge, clipped to my collar. At the entrance, Dalton stood greeting guests, his smile professional. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Carter, I thought I told you your duties were elsewhere." I held up the staff badge. "Audio division," I said lightly. "Just filling in for Ellen Cooper." His mouth twitched, uncertain. Before he could respond, another officer called his name, and I slipped past him through the staff access door. Inside, the hum of equipment welcomed me like an old friend. The main console glowed with lines of code and audio tracks labeled Tribute 1, Tribute 2, Final Roll. I inserted a small drive into the port and opened the media folder. My file labeled Echo Blue Revised sat quietly at the bottom. I checked the sound levels, adjusted the playback time, and set the sequence. Everything looked perfect. Outside the hall, filled with people, the noise building like a wave. I glanced at the schedule. Richard's award presentation was listed after the main tribute video. The irony nearly made me laugh. They would honor him minutes after hearing his own voice in Betrayal. Grace texted a single line from across town. "Once you press play, do not look back." I typed back, "Understood." The first speeches began, the band played, and the audience settled. I watched the timer on the console approach the mark I had set. For a second, my reflection appeared on the dark screen beside Michael's photo, two ghosts sharing the same light. The sound engineer next to me asked, "Everything good?" "Perfect," I said. When the lights dimmed for the tribute video, I rested my hand on the play button. The hall fell silent except for the faint hum of the projector. The moment stretched calm and sharp. It was time. The air inside the Charleston Memorial Hall was heavy with ceremony and pride. Rows of uniforms shimmered under the light metals, catching every glint from the chandeliers. I stood at the control booth behind the stage headset on watching the synchronized rhythm of the event unfold. The band had just finished playing the national anthem, and the crowd's applause rolled like a wave through the hall. I could see Richard Carter seated in the front row, his back straight. His uniform pressed his silver hair gleaming under the spotlight. Beside him sat Evelyn, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes proud and weary. Dalton stood a few seats away, chest puffed out, face locked in a smirk that I had grown to know too well. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now honor Colonel Richard Carter for his exemplary service to our nation." The applause began again, polite and strong. Richard rose, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the podium. He spoke the way a man does when he knows the audience already loves him. "Thank you. It has been the honor of my life to serve this country, to lead men of courage, and to uphold the values of integrity, duty, and truth." The words honor, duty, and truth fell like weights. I watched the faces of the crowd, older veterans, families, young soldiers nodding along, believing every syllable. Richard continued, "The Carter family stands for those same values, always has, always will." His voice filled the hall, confident, unwavering. My hand hovered above the control console. The final tribute video was queued up just like every ceremony before. The title slide appeared on my monitor in memory of our fallen heroes. The band played a soft melody and the lights dimmed. My heart beat slow and steady. I pressed play. The first minute was familiar clips of soldiers' photos, short lines of narration honoring the fallen. The audience was silent except for the occasional sniffle. Then as the slideshow transitioned, my inserted file began to play. Michael's voice, calm and unmistakable, filled the hall. If you're hearing this, my coordinates were leaked by someone I trusted. The words seemed to slice the air. The background music stopped abruptly like it had forgotten how to continue. A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. The video froze on Michael's face, smiling in uniform. Then his voice came again, quieter, steady. "Tell my wife that the truth matters more than the medals." A murmur ran through the audience. In the front row, Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. Richard stiffened, his color draining. Dalton leaned forward in his chair, eyes darting toward the control booth. He knew that voice. He knew exactly what was coming. Michael's tone shifted. "If command reviews this check supply route A13, someone changed it without authorization. Someone made sure we would not come back." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the soft clink of a metal against fabric as someone shifted uncomfortably. Richard's jaw clenched. Dalton's hand trembled against his knee. Every veteran in that room recognized the meaning of what they had just heard. Betrayal inside the chain of command, the worst sin a soldier could commit. I felt the eyes of the audience turning toward the front row, toward the two men whose names suddenly echoed through every whisper. Richard tried to stand but swayed slightly. He turned, scanning the room for an explanation. Dalton half rose from his seat, sweat visible along his collar. The video ended with Michael's recorded breathing, steady, then a click as the transmission cut off. The projector flickered, then displayed a black screen with white text that read, "Captain Michael Carter, Fort Jackson Unit, fallen, but not forgotten." The applause that usually followed never came. No one moved. The only sound was the shifting of chairs and a low gasp from somewhere near the back. I stepped forward from the shadows of the booth microphone still in my hand. The spotlight was not meant for me, but it found me anyway as I spoke. He always believed in justice even when it hurts. My voice carried softly, not defiant, just true. The crowd turned to look. Some faces were stunned, others tearful. A few older veterans nodded slowly, the understanding written in their lined expressions. Richard finally found his voice. "Turn that off," he barked, his authority cracking mid-sentence. "This is not official. This is an attack." His words sounded small, swallowed by the weight of silence. Dalton stepped closer to him, whispering something urgent, but Richard shook him off. Across the aisle, a reporter lifted a camera. The flash burst through the air, a harsh white glare that caught both men mid-gesture. The audience's murmurs grew louder, shifting from confusion to recognition. They had seen enough ceremonies to know what was real and what was staged. Grace's words echoed in my mind. "Revenge isn't loud. It's surgical." The surgery was done. I stepped back from the console, letting the recording replay once more. Michael's voice repeated its final line, "Someone betrayed our unit." The repetition felt like a heartbeat pulsing through the hall. When it stopped, I turned off the feed. For a moment, no one moved. Then Evelyn rose slowly to her feet. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with clarity. She looked at her husband for a long time before whispering, "What did you do, Richard?" The question was quiet, but it carried across the room like thunder. Reporters surged forward, snapping photos, asking questions. The event organizer tried to regain control, but the crowd had already shifted from reverence to outrage. A veteran near the front row muttered, "Shame on you," and others echoed it under their breath. Dalton pushed his way toward the exit, head down, but flashes followed him. Richard stood frozen, his lifetime of control dissolving under the glare of exposure. I slipped the headset off and stepped away from the console. The light from the stage washed over me, and for the first time in 2 years, I did not feel small. I walked past the rows of uniforms, past the stunned faces, and stopped just short of the stage. The ceremony banner behind Richard fluttered slightly in the air conditioning. It read, "For honor, duty, and truth." I looked at it then, back at him. "Sometimes truth takes its time," I said quietly. Then I turned and walked out, leaving the applause that never came and the silence that finally spoke for me. By the next morning, the story had spread across every major news outlet. The Charleston Tribune ran it, "First War Heroes' Final Words Expose Corruption." Within hours, the headline appeared everywhere on morning television, on military forums, and across social media, feeds filled with disbelief and anger. The video from the ceremony had been recorded by at least 5 people, each clip showing the same devastating moment when Michael's voice exposed the truth. The internet did what it always does. It turned truth into wildfire. By noon, the Pentagon issued a statement confirming a full-scale investigation into the Fort Jackson operations under Colonel Richard Carter's tenure. Dalton was placed on immediate suspension. Pending inquiry, his office sealed, his records confiscated. The military police escorted him from his residence that evening. Reporters swarmed his driveway, shouting questions, but he kept his head down, muttering no comment as flashbulbs burst around him. The footage aired nationwide. For the first time, his arrogance had nowhere to hide. Richard, meanwhile, tried to control the narrative. He released a brief televised statement claiming the recording had been manipulated, that his voice had been taken out of context, but his face betrayed him. The tremor in his hand, the falter in his tone, the tightness in his jaw, it all told a story far louder than his words. Within 48 hours, the Department of Veterans Affairs revoked his honorary pension pending the investigation's outcome. The Carter family name, once synonymous with discipline and pride, had become a symbol of betrayal. I watched it unfold quietly from my apartment, the television casting pale light across the room. Grace sat across from me, sipping tea, calm as ever. "That's karma in uniform, sweetheart," she said finally. "It wears its medals differently, but it always shows up." I smiled faintly. She was right. The satisfaction wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steady, like the slow settling of dust after an explosion. Outside, the world roared, but inside I felt only stillness. The next few days blurred into a strange kind of chaos. I began receiving emails from journalists wanting exclusive interviews, authors requesting rights to my story, producers asking for adaptation deals. One message read, "We believe your husband's legacy deserves to be shared with the world." Another, more dramatic, offered to fly me to Los Angeles for a prime-time documentary. My inbox became a battlefield of curiosity and greed. I didn't reply to any of them. Then my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. When I answered, a cheerful voice said, "Hi, is this Emily Carter? This is Lauren from Pacific Motion Studios. We'd love to talk about turning your incredible journey into a feature film." I hesitated, then laughed softly. "I'm not an actress," I told her. "I'm a witness." There was silence on the other end, followed by a polite chuckle. "I'll take that as a maybe," she said before hanging up. When I told Grace, she laughed until tears welled in her eyes. "Hollywood," she said between breaths, "doesn't know what to do with real women. They only know scripts." I smiled. Maybe some stories aren't meant for the screen. Maybe they're meant to stay raw. By the end of the week, the investigation committee released preliminary findings confirming irregularities in supply route documentation and operational security breaches. The report stopped short of naming individuals, but everyone knew. Dalton and Richard were the names whispered in every military circle. Anonymous sources leaked details to the press, misappropriated funds, falsified mission logs, and evidence of cover-ups stretching years. Every revelation added another crack to the facade of their legacy. Evelyn retreated from public view. She sent me a short handwritten note a few days later. It simply said, "I didn't know Emily." I hope you can believe that. I placed the note beside Michael's photograph on my desk. I didn't hate her. Some people are prisoners of silence, and she had served her sentence long enough. At Fort Jackson, the atmosphere changed overnight. The same soldiers who once whispered behind my back now nodded respectfully when I passed. Private Jones, the young recruit who had awkwardly apologized to me months earlier, saluted me one morning and said, "Ma'am, your husband would be proud." I thanked him quietly, though what I felt wasn't pride, it was release. One afternoon, as I walked past the old communications room, I noticed that Michael's portrait had been restored on the Wall of Honor. Someone had polished the brass plate beneath it until it gleamed. The inscription read, "Captain Michael Carter, Courage Beyond Command." I stood there for a long time, letting the moment settle into me. Grace found me later by the parking lot. She handed me a small envelope. "The case is officially under federal review now," she said. "They'll dig deep. You don't need to be involved anymore." I opened the envelope and found a printed article titled "Integrity in Uniform." It was a feature about me about how a widow had quietly brought down corruption from within. The final line read, "Justice sometimes speaks in whispers, not war cries." I looked up at Grace. "Did you write this?" She smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe someone finally paid attention." The irony of it all didn't escape me. The same people who once dismissed me as just a widow were now quoting my silence, like scripture. That night I took a walk by the river. The air smelled of salt and moss the same way it had the night before Michael's last deployment. I watched the water shift under the moonlight and thought about how strange justice could be, how it could destroy and heal in the same breath. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks from another celebration lit the sky, but I didn't flinch. The noise no longer mattered. What mattered was the echo it left behind, steady and honest. When I went home, I turned off my phone, poured a glass of wine, and whispered to the photo on my desk, "We did it." Then I laughed quietly to myself, not from triumph, but from peace. 2 months after the ceremony, the world had already moved on, or at least pretended to. News cycles had shifted to fresher scandals, and the Carters had vanished from public view. I had gone back to work quietly, living in a small house near the coast where the sound of the sea kept me grounded. It was a mild morning in January when the knock came. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened the door, Richard Carter stood there, older than I remembered, thinner eyes, ringed with sleeplessness. His once immaculate suit looked wrinkled, his posture stiff but fragile. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sea breeze moved between us like a wall. "May I come in?" he asked finally. I hesitated, then stepped aside. The man who entered was not the commanding colonel I had once feared. He looked like someone crushed under the weight of his own reflection. I offered him tea out of politeness, and he accepted, sitting heavily at the small wooden table by the window. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and low. "You have destroyed our family's honor." My hand stayed steady as I poured the tea. His words fell into the air like old bullets, harmless now, too slow to wound. I set the cup in front of him, then sat opposite. "No," I said softly. "You destroyed your son's unit." I just pressed play. He flinched, as if I had struck him. His fingers tightened around the cup, the liquid trembling inside. "You think this is justice?" he muttered, his voice rising with the same authority that once silenced rooms. "You think shaming me in public brings him back?" I looked out the window at the gray stretch of water. "Justice was never about bringing anyone back," I said. "It is about making sure no one forgets who sent them away." He tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. His eyes darted around the small kitchen, the photographs on the wall, the modest dishes, the absence of trophies or medals. There was nothing left here for him to command. "You have no idea what it means to live with guilt," he said, almost whispering now. I met his gaze. "Don't assume that. I live with it every day, too. The difference is mine isn't hidden behind ceremony." He looked down, his shoulders sagging. For a long moment, he just stared at the steam rising from his tea, as if it might give him a different answer. Then he said something unexpected. "I loved him, you know. Michael was my pride." I nodded slowly. "Then why did you let him die?" He closed his eyes. "Because I believed in the wrong people," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "I let ambition sound like loyalty. I almost felt pity, but it dissolved quickly. Pity had no place here. You could have told the truth years ago," I said quietly. "You could have stopped it." He shook his head weakly. "And lose everything. My career, my reputation, everything I built." I leaned forward. "You already lost it. The only thing left is what you do with the truth." He looked up at me, then eyes wet but defiant. "Withdraw your statement," he said. "Tell them it was edited, manipulated. You can still fix this." I laughed, once short and humorless. "Fix it? You can't fix betrayal with denial." "The truth isn't a rumor, Richard. It's a recording." He slammed his hand on the table, the teacup rattling. "You don't understand what this has done. They've taken my pension. My name is ruined. I've given this country 40 years, and you've taken it all." His voice broke on the word taken. I stood calm and steady and looked down at him. "No, Richard. You gave this country soldiers. You took their peace." He stared at me, chest heaving, but the rage had nowhere left to go. It was like watching a storm die out mid-ocean, all thunder gone, leaving only the empty sky. After a long pause, he whispered, "I wanted to protect my family." I shook my head. "You wanted to protect your pride. Michael didn't die because of duty. He died because you couldn't let go of power." The silence that followed felt like a verdict. He stared at the table, his hands trembling. I turned to refill the kettle, giving him the dignity of not watching him crumble. When I returned, he had his face buried in his hands. His voice came muffled. "What am I supposed to do now?" I placed a napkin beside his cup. "Live with it," I said. "It's lighter than what he had to carry." He didn't look up again. After a while, he rose slowly, nodded once, and walked to the door. Before leaving, he stopped and said softly, "You sound like him when you speak." That more than anything caught me off guard. When the door closed behind him, I stood still, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade down the walkway. Outside, gulls called over the sound of the sea. I sat back down, lifted my cup, and let the silence fill the space he had left behind. Quiet revenge never needs applause. It only needs the truth to stand unshaken. 3 days after Richard's visit, Grace called and asked me to meet her at the Charleston Pier. The winter air was sharp, the sky washed in silver, and gulls floated lazily above the calm water. I found her sitting on a bench with a thermos of coffee and a small black folder on her lap. When she looked up, her expression was more serious than I had ever seen it. "Sit down," she said. I sat. She handed me the folder without a word. Inside was a single document marked Classified Declassified 2024. At the top, bold letters read Operation Echo Blue. Beneath it were names none familiar except one, Michael Carter. I frowned. "What is this?" Grace leaned back, her eyes narrowing against the wind. "Something you were never supposed to see." I waited. She continued slowly. "Your husband wasn't just part of the communications unit. He was Echo Blue, the code name for a covert intelligence group formed to investigate internal corruption in the military supply network." My pulse quickened. "Are you saying he was spying on his own people?" She nodded. "In a sense. He volunteered for it after suspecting that operations were being compromised from within. They needed someone who could blend in, someone they wouldn't suspect." I opened the file again. The lines blurred for a second as realization hit. So when he recorded that final message, Grace's voice softened. He wasn't just leaving a warning. He was protecting you. My mind reeled. Protecting me. She nodded again. "You remember that line? If I die, someone betrayed our unit. That wasn't meant for the brass. It was meant for you." He had discovered that Richard was part of the chain leaking information, but more importantly, he had found out you were at risk because you unknowingly handled classified communication during your work at Fort Jackson. You processed one of the encrypted files without realizing its significance. That made you a target. I stared at her. My throat went dry. So he made sure his death would expose them before they could reach you. Grace exhaled. His last transmission triggered a safety protocol. It logged the final coordinates into the system connecting his disappearance to the altered supply route. That's how the cover-up eventually unraveled. It wasn't random justice, Emily. It was Michael's design. The folder felt heavy in my hands. I remembered the nights before his last deployment, how distant he seemed, how he had kissed my forehead and said, "No matter what happens, don't lose faith in what's right." Back then, I thought it was just something soldiers said before leaving. Now it sounded like prophecy. Grace took a sip of coffee. He never told anyone he was Echo Blue, not even his commanding officer. It was a need-to-know operation, and no one did. She paused, her eyes softening. Until you found the file, no one outside intelligence knew it existed. I closed the folder and pressed it to my chest. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and memory. I asked, "Why tell me this now?" She looked at me with quiet understanding. "Because you deserve closure, not just justice. You carried his secret without knowing it. Now it's time to set it down." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the water slap gently against the pier. After a moment, Grace reached into her coat pocket and handed me a small USB drive. "One last file," she said. "His real final recording. It was never stored in the database. He sent it to me with instructions to deliver it to you when I thought you were ready." My fingers trembled as I took it. I wanted to say something, but no words formed. That night, I sat in my living room with only the glow of the lamp and the sound of the sea outside. I plugged the drive into my laptop, and the file opened automatically. Michael's face appeared grainy but unmistakable. His voice was calm, the same quiet strength that had steadied me for years. "Emily, if you're seeing this, it means things went further than I could control. Don't be afraid. You were never just my wife. You were my reason to believe the truth mattered." He paused, his eyes softening. "They think they can erase people like me, but they can't erase what we stood for. You're stronger than you know. Live freely." The camera shook slightly as he adjusted it, his tone shifting. Echo Blue wasn't a mission. It was a promise that corruption would always face the light. You're the one who kept that promise. His voice grew faint, but the last words were clear. "I love you. Tell the truth for both of us." The screen faded to black. For a long time, I didn't move. My chest felt tight, but the tears didn't come right away. When they finally did, they came quietly spilling down without sobs or sound. It wasn't grief anymore. It was release. The revenge, the exposure, the shame, all of it had been his plan from the beginning, and I unknowingly had finished it. I replayed the video once more, then closed the laptop and sat in the silence that followed. Outside, the tide rolled in, and somewhere in the distance, a ship horn echoed faintly. It sounded like a salute. I whispered into the empty room, "Thank you, Michael." Then I smiled through the tears. The truth had outlived the pain, and in that moment, it felt like he was finally home. 1 year later, the city of Charleston shimmered under a soft morning light. The new Veterans Memorial stood taller now, rebuilt after the renovations that followed last year's scandal. I walked across the courtyard toward the stage where rows of empty chairs faced the ocean. It was the anniversary of the truth, the day Michael's voice had broken the silence. This time, the event was mine to lead. As I adjusted the microphone, the hum of the sea blended with the low chatter of arriving guests. The faces were different now. Younger, soldiers, widows, families of fallen officers, people who understood the quiet price of service. When the band finished tuning, the crowd settled. I took a breath and began. "We aren't just widows. We're the voices they left behind." My words carried easily through the open air. The audience fell still listening. For years, we were told that silence was strength, that tears were weakness, but silence can also be a cage. Today, we speak for those who can't. We stand for the truth they fought to protect. My voice didn't shake. The wind lifted strands of my hair, and I let it. The camera crews captured the moment, but I didn't look at them. I looked out toward the horizon where the sky and sea met in a quiet line. Somewhere out there, Michael's ship had once sailed. The ceremony continued with a roll call of the fallen. When they reached Captain Michael Carter, the band played Taps the slow and mournful tune, drifting over the crowd. This time there was no interruption, no manipulation, only reverence. Afterward, I walked off stage to where Grace stood waiting. She smiled, a faint glimmer of pride in her eyes. "You did good, honey," she said softly. I nodded. I think he'd be proud. Grace looked toward the large outdoor screen broadcasting the ceremony. The feed shifted to a documentary montage, a segment prepared by the Veterans Committee to mark how accountability had reshaped the base. The first image appeared Dalton head-shaved, working in a rehabilitation facility for veterans, his face older, but finally human. The narrator's voice described his cooperation with the internal reforms and how his sentence had been reduced in exchange for testimony. The next frame cut to a quiet nursing home. Richard Carter sat alone by a window, dressed in plain clothes, his medals removed. He stared outside, unmoving. The camera lingered on his profile, then faded to black. The audience shifted uncomfortably. There was no applause, just a collective silence that felt like acceptance. Grace leaned closer. "The story always finishes itself," she whispered. "It just needs someone brave enough to start it." After the ceremony, people came to shake my hand. Some were widows, some officers, some simply strangers who wanted to say thank you. Their eyes carried the same weight. Mine once did. The quiet understanding that justice isn't always loud. When the last person left, I walked down to the pier where the water stretched wide and endless. I carried with me a small envelope sealed with Michael's handwriting. Inside was the letter I had written. After watching his final message, a letter I had never sent. It wasn't a confession or farewell. It was gratitude. I sat on the bench, opened my recorder, and spoke softly into it. For the record, Captain Carter, your mission is complete. Then I stopped the recording, closed the device, and stood. The tide had begun to rise, brushing the edge of the pier with foamy persistence. I tore the letter into strips, watching the paper drift into the water, one piece at a time. Each fragment dissolved quickly, leaving nothing behind but ripples. The horizon shimmered gold as the sun broke through a thin veil of clouds. For the first time in years, the sound of taps didn't make my chest ache. It sounded like release. A soft wind carried the tune from the memorial speakers behind me, the trumpet echoing faintly across the harbor. I whispered, "You can rest now," and walked away without looking back. That evening, I returned home and placed the recorder on my desk. I pressed play and listened to the silence between the notes. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything I had survived. I wrote one final line in my notebook. Sometimes quiet justice speaks louder than anger. If you've ever faced betrayal, remember dignity over money. Truth over power and revenge through truth always finds its way. I closed the notebook and smiled. The world outside had grown dark, but my house glowed with warmth. Justice had come and gone, but its echo remained steady, humble, and mine.